to the second episode of the Journal of Genocide Researchers Office Hours, which comprises interviews with our authors. Today we're speaking with Dr. Anne Irfan, because she wrote an article in our forum on Israel-Palestine, atrocity crimes, and the crisis of Holocaust and genocide studies. The article is called Settler Colonialism and the Displacement Immobility Nexus, Israel Policy in Gaza Since 1948. Was published on our journal website on August 25th, 2025. It's had nearly 1,000 views since then, so the article is being widely read. Anne Irfan is one of the foremost experts on Gaza. She is a lecturer in interdisciplinary race, gender, and post-colonial studies at University College London. She was previously a lecturer at the University of Oxford's Refugee Studies Centre and has also taught at the London School of Economics and the University of Sussex. More generally, Anne Irfan is a leading expert on Palestinian refugee rights, the UN, and UNRWA. Her work has appeared in many academic journals, and her first book is called Refuge and Resistance, Palestinians and the International Refugee System, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2023. And she's now just published a new book called A Short History of the Gaza Strip. Discussing her article in this episode as well is one of the other journal editors, Omar Mekdoum, who is an associate professor of comparative politics in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics. Before coming to the LSE, he held research fellowships at Harvard University and at Oxford University, as well as having professional experience as a policy officer for the World Bank and as a legal officer for the government of Guyana and on electoral missions for the UN and Africa. Omar is the author of many publications, including the 2020 major monograph called The Path to Genocide in Rwanda, Security, Opportunity, and Authority in an Ethnographic State. Omar has also written 2 pieces in this journal's Gaza forums, a most recent one on strategies of denial in our Gaza and Genocide Studies Roundtable. Then there is Ashit Mehta, who is a social media volunteer at this journal. He has worked as a media professional for nearly a decade with experience in documenting mass atrocities and hate speech by the state in media. And running the show behind the scenes is Tisha van Brebra, based in London. Omar, over to you.
Well, thank you, Dirk. We're very excited to be here today to have you, Anne. Anne, your article that you published with us just last month is obviously very timely. It comes just shortly before the United States, under the Trump administration, has announced what it claims will be an end to this war, and with a proposal for how Gaza will be governed in the aftermath of the war. But perhaps, obviously, you did not know perhaps that was going to happen, but now that you know that it has, perhaps you could start, though, by telling us what the central argument is in the article and giving us an overview of what you hope it would communicate to its readers.
Thanks very much for having me here today, and thanks for the question, Omar. So the central line of the argument is that Israel, since its establishment in 1948, and to some degree even the Zionist movement that predated that, has pursued a policy towards Palestinians in general, and specifically in Gaza, that I characterize by this terminology of the displacement immobility nexus. And what I mean by that is that Israel has used measures that both displace and immobilize the Palestinians, again, particularly in Gaza, as a way of enacting its settler colonial control over the entire territory of historic Palestine. I argue that while instinctively we might see these two things as existing in opposition to one another, so we're talking about forcing people to move versus denying them the right to move, I argue that in reality, these things are often enacted in tandem. And I also make the point that this is something that can be found in settler colonial examples throughout history and around the world, because they pertain to land grab and to the establishment of a demographic hierarchy, both of which are key features of settler colonial projects. In terms of what I wanted to convey or achieve with the article, I think one possibly basic, but still important point I had in mind was trying to really get across the sense that the last 2 years have a much longer history to them, that while obviously the scale of the last 2 years is unprecedented, many of the characteristics have a much longer term nature to them, that there's a degree of consistency rather than necessarily aberration. And I think I actually used the term in the article that what we're really seeing here is a culmination rather than an aberration. To some degree, this is trying to push against the chronologies that have emerged that place October the 7th, 2023 as the starting date, but it's also trying to get away from this idea that there's something entirely unprecedented about everything that we've seen since then.
Excellent. Yes, that's what I also took away from reading it, is that the article provides very useful historical perspective on what may be considered continuity in the way that Israel has treated Gaza and its residents. And I also understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're arguing is that the power to move, to forcibly move, and also the power to forcibly immobilize Palestinians in Gaza is a hallmark of domination, that it is what defines the power that Israel, the Israeli government, has over Palestinians. Is that right? You see this nexus as a hallmark of domination?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a hallmark of Israeli domination. It's a signifier of that domination. The fact that they're able to carry this out signifies the ultimately asymmetrical nature of what is sometimes described, particularly in the West, as a conflict. And again, I think this can be connected to broader issues in settler colonial studies about how it is that particular powers exert that domination.
Well, let me pick you up there on this, on the comparison with other settler colonial projects. There will be readers who may take exception to the description or the characterization of this as being colonial, but I think it would be hard to disagree with the idea that there involves settlements. But I read in the article that you made some comparison, for example, with the treatment of Black South Africans and the creation of Bantustans. And you also made a point that the forced transfer along the tier of trails of Native Americans, that these are comparable or somewhat comparable policies in the way that settlers have treated indigenous groups. But I wanted to ask you whether there is something distinctive about the Israeli government treatment of Gaza. And clearly, whilst immobilization and expulsion or transfer are not unique, what struck me, though, here is that when there is forced immobility, so they are confined to Gaza, there has also been multiple episodes of violence that have been inflicted, the use of force, military force against Gazans, even though they are in the areas that the Israeli government has designated that they should be in. So I wondered, is this something distinctive about Gaza? Or have we seen settlers also use force against indigenous groups in the areas that they've designated them to be in as well?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really interesting question. And probably the first thing I would say here is that while I do make these comparisons, and I think there's value in these comparisons, I would also probably be cautious about overstating the comparisons. So obviously there's a value to using this conceptual category of settler colonialism, but I would want to avoid too much flattening that removes any of the distinctions at the same time. So to your question, I mean, there's so much that we could discuss on this question of what is distinctive here. The point that's typically made, kind of generally speaking, is that people will say that, you know, the Israeli settler colonial case comes later than all of the others, and that it almost misses the heyday of settler colonialism in that sense. But I know that's not really quite what you're getting at here. In terms of what's distinctive, the first thing that comes to my mind is, and this is one of the arguments in the article as well, is that obviously Gaza is not the whole of Palestine by any means, and it's not even where the majority of Palestinians under Israeli rule live. So the first point of distinctiveness is the way in which Israel has treated Gaza to some degree distinctively from other parts of Palestine, specifically the West Bank. And that, again, goes back to 1948, and I talk about why that is in the article, and the fact that a lot of it has to do with Gaza's demographics as a majority refugee population, which distinguish it from the West Bank. So that's one thing to say. But in terms of your more specific question about the fact that the Palestinians are sort of in their designated area, but are still being subjected to violence, and obviously in the last 2 years to genocidal violence, I think that is probably less unusual than we might instinctively think, because punishment is the other kind of key element of these dynamics. That immobilization, confinement, this kind of form of large-scale carcerality, part of its function is to enable punishment. And that punishment can be carried out, obviously, pretty easily by the fact of confinement itself, but also then by using confinement as an easy way to punish people. Something else I talk about in the article, and I talk about this in more depth in the book, is the fact that after the Sharon government evacuated all of the Israeli settlers from Gaza in 2005, there's a very clear correlation between that and the really sharp escalation in violence, Israeli violence in Gaza subsequently, because it becomes this entirely Palestinian space whereby the confinement of the Palestinians kind of facilitates this mass violence where Israel is no longer concerned that it might be accidentally targeting Jewish settlers.
Yes, thank you. That's useful comparative perspective. As somebody who studies civil wars and internal conflicts more generally, one of the things that did strike me and that motivated my question is the fact that when you do have civil wars or internal conflicts where governments engage in counterinsurgency to deal with quiescent populations, usually the response from the civilian population is to move. They move out of harm's way. But in this case, that's not possible because they are confined. So that strikes me, at least in comparison with, say, other civil wars, the inability to become a refugee is something that is quite distinctive about the Gaza experience.
Yeah, and I deliberately open with that quote from Haider Eid, where he's saying Israelis tell us to go. It's also but they're at the same time they're closing the borders.
Right. Can I pick up on something you said a little earlier about the motivation or the rationale for the use of force was punishment? But can I ask you what you think the rationale is for the nexus, for the forced immobilization and for the forced expulsion? Because I noted in your article that you push back against the Israeli government narrative that the reason that they do this is for security. And you point out rightly that the closed-door policy, so the sealing of Gaza's borders in 1991, predates the first suicide attack by Hamas in 1993, and it predates Hamas's takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2006, I think. So that makes sense in historical terms. But just imagine for a moment that I were in the shoes of the Israeli government. Might they say that the security rationale is justifiable still? Because if you were to look back over the history of Gaza, going back to the creation of Israel, there have been incidents, security incidents, where Gazans have struck against Israel. And indeed, I suppose the first intifada begins in Gaza in 1987, 4 years before the sealing of the border. So I guess my question then is if it's not security, if that's not the rationale, then what is it in your view?
Okay, thanks for the question. And I think there's a few things to say here. I mean, absolutely, the first Intifada, the first Intifada is clearly a key factor behind the 1991 sealing of the borders. There's no doubt about that. What I'm questioning more is the degree to which this is a security concern rather than, a form of punishment for the mass uprising of Palestinians during the first Intifada. I think while you're correct to point out that there have been incursions from Gaza from as early as 48 and its aftermath, including incursions that have attacked civilians as well as soldiers in the military, in a way, we can also turn that on its head and say, if that's always been the case, why have we seen these fluctuations in the degree of closure or opening of Gaza? So I think there's a few things to say in terms of how we can understand this. To go back to the core point, there's what I call in the book, and I believe in the article as well, the original quandary of Zionism, which is how you're going to establish a Jewish state in a country that has a non-Jewish majority. Or that has a Jewish minority, to put it in another way. And one way you do that, obviously, is by mass Jewish immigration, which happens in the 30s and 40s, but it still doesn't achieve a full majority. So the other way you do that is by expulsion, like expelling and displacing the majority indigenous population. And, in fact, this is now pretty widely acknowledged, including by people who have a Zionist position. There's not really any way around this. So in terms of explaining the original establishment of this nexus, that's really the key to it. It's that you first, to do this, you need to expel displaced people, and then the immobility comes in as a way of preventing them from returning. That's sort of the element of the original Nakba that we tend to hear a little bit less about, that it's not just the expulsion, but also the prevention of their return, which is enforced very violently in the late 1940s and 1950s, which, again, is covered in the article. And then as time goes on, the question becomes for Israel what it's going to do with the fact that it still has a very significant Palestinian minority who are given second-class citizenship of Israel, and that it has these, two majority Palestinian populations on its doorstep in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And from 1956, it occupies Gaza for the first time, and then obviously from 1967 to this day, it becomes a long-term occupying regime over both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And there are these tensions ongoing within the Israeli government about what they're going to do. And they fairly early on decide after 67 that another round of mass expulsions is not going to be workable because they think it will risk US support in particular, and it is going to risk international condemnation, and they don't think it's workable. So that's sort of how we get to this arrival of this long-term alternative. It starts with 20 years of this sort of lower level nexus, which is sometimes called the open door, where there's limited mobility allowed for Palestinians. And then once Palestinians start to push back against that with the Intifada, the first Intifada, it resorts to a kind of intensification of that nexus. I think what we've seen over the last 2 years is a real push by a lot of forces within Israel to now actually try and move to the next stage, because there's been very open, explicit calls, as you know, for full-on ethnic cleansing, plans from Israel, also from the US, to mass relocate Palestinians from Gaza elsewhere. And I think you could argue that's sort of the long-term effect of this, because as we see from cases throughout history, often mass expulsion begins actually with confining people to one demarcated area. That's what can facilitate their eventual expulsion.
Yes, I like that phrase, the Zionist quandary, and I want to pick up on this. And you mentioned that you feel that over the history of since the creation of the State of Israel, that there's perhaps some indecision or some uncertainty about how or what to do with Gaza. And I wondered whether the seemingly contradictory impulses to want to both expel Gazans from Gaza and at the same time want to confine them to Gaza, does this reflect internal differences at different points in Israeli political history for how to deal with this? Or have we got to a point now where you think that there is a consensus within, say, the Israeli political class that if there were not international constraints, so pushback from outside of Israel, that removing or transferring Gazans to another third-party Arab state would be the preferred solution? Have we gotten to this point where we have this consensus inside Israel?
There's no question that the possibility or the suggestion of what is essentially ethnic cleansing, mass force relocation or expulsion, has become far more acceptable in the Israeli mainstream discourse than it was, certainly 20 years ago. These things that used to have a stigma or a taboo or be seen as kind of the domain of the far right have become part of polite conversation. There's no doubt about that. Certainly since October the 7th and the attacks and crimes of October the 7th, but even preceding that, Israeli society and the mainstream was moving far to the right. One thing I would pick up on is, I think, while you're absolutely right that the sort of international opposition to it is a major obstacle, the other major obstacle is the Palestinians themselves, and that they're just total steadfast refusal to go along with it. Because while I don't go into this in full detail in the article because of space, I talk about it more in the book. That's the kind of flip side of the nexus, which is that over the years, the Palestinians have really overwhelmingly, with a few exceptions and very few exceptions, pretty much refused to acquiesce to this nexus. They have tried to break it wherever possible. And we saw that again over the last 2 years, even while living through a genocide. Overwhelmingly, they rejected this suggestion. And it did become clear that if they were going to implement it, it was going to require very direct, very brutal force, which went hand in hand with the fear of international condemnation.
Right. So I'm going to put myself in the Israeli government shoes once more and ask you the question of what is the alternative to this treatment, to this nexus? So if the Israeli government has tried an open door policy from 1972 to 1991, where they allowed Gazans access to Israel for work, and they've also tried the closed-door policy from 1991 onwards, where they have sealed the borders. And then they have also tried withdrawal in 2005 with Sharon's decision to disengage and remove the settlements. So I suppose my question is, if you are the Israeli government, putting aside what the Trump peace plan proposes, what do you think would be a more appropriate way for Israel to deal with the situation in Gaza?
So this is the argument that you would typically hear. The first thing I just want to pick up on is that and I know you're aware of this, obviously, but I think it is important to make the point, is that the 2005 disengagement wasn't a full withdrawal. And by many measures, Israel remained the occupying power of Gaza then. And I think the kind of, the erroneous narrative that it was a withdrawal has also given rise to a lot of the kind of myths that have grown up since then. But leaving that aside, I mean, even it's worth making the point again that even with the open door policy from 72 to 91, this was not a policy of equality or equal rights. There's never been a policy of equality and equal rights. So it was a policy whereby most Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank could enter Israel to work with strict limitations. They couldn't stay the night. They certainly couldn't return to their homes there, keeping in mind, again, that the majority of Palestinians in Gaza are Nakba refugees, and about a third of those in the West Bank are Nakba refugees. They didn't have, full citizenship. And they obviously didn't have unlike Israeli citizens, they didn't have the right to elect the government that was making all of these decisions that ruled their lives. So the one thing Israel has never tried is equality. And actually, if you look at some of the debates that played out in the Israeli political classes and also in Israeli intellectual circles after 1967, this was actually a conversation that people had, that they said, what will happen if we end up with this just long-term occupation of people living without rights under our dominion? And that is what has ended up happening. And that's before we even get into the fact that the Palestinians living within Israel were themselves, immobilized, placed under martial law until 1966. So the kind of the obvious answer would probably be that maybe they could try a policy of equality. We seem now just so far, in some ways we seem
Right.
further than we've ever been from that now, that it's really hard to even imagine that as a feasible possibility. Not to mention the fact that Netanyahu has said, as recently as I think a fortnight ago, he said that there will never be a Palestinian state on his watch. So there's a rejection of both any possibility of shared equal citizenship and also a rejection of any possibility of kind of the separate, but what you might call the separate but equal option.
Right. Great. Well, thank you. Those are questions I wanted to ask. I know that we have others here in the room who had questions for you as well. Ashit, did you want to put a question to Anne?
Yes. Thank you, Omar. And thanks, Annie, for kind of talking in detail about the displacement in mobility nexus. Over the past 2 years, I've noticed that the immobility nexus does not only kind of confine an individual, a Palestinian, to kind of physically move, but also not express emotion. So, for instance, whenever the prisoner or hostage exchanges have happened from Palestine and Israel, Israel makes sure that media is not allowed to interview the Palestinian hostages or even allow the families to celebrate. Could you please share how that also is a form of immobility nexus, and how can it be challenged historically with some examples?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And we've actually seen that again. I mean, we're having this conversation on the day where we're seeing the initial first stage of the release. And again, the Israeli authorities have made it clear to Palestinians that they will not be allowed any kind of public celebrations of their loved ones returning home. And they've also been told not to speak to the media. So it's very much an ongoing phenomenon. I mean, it's, as you say, it's kind of an immobilizing of people's emotions, but I think it's also another implementation of the hierarchy of who is allowed to feel things and who is not allowed to feel things. And also, in the same way that, some people's grief is seen as more valid, some people's joy is also seen as more valid than others. I think on an even more basic level, this probably connects to a point that Omar made, that this is around domination as well. And it's a hallmark of domination, but it's also, almost like a power flex and a way of just signifying that you have this control. So many elements of military occupation and military domination, I mean, not only in Palestine, but in all kinds of cases, has these really deep-rooted psychological elements to it as well. So one thing I talk about in the book is how, Palestinians over the years have placed a really strong emphasis on this idea of samud, which very loosely translates as steadfastness, although it doesn't have quite the same kind of resonance in English. And it's this idea that, resisting the occupation can come from these everyday acts of resistance that pertain to things like staying on the land, staying in your home, but also things like, celebrating joy in your lives and almost refusing to internalize what the occupation is imposing on you, refusing to acquiesce to the dehumanization, because emotional immobilization is part of dehumanization.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashit. Dirk, did you want to ask Anne something?
Yes, I thought we could also talk about the strategic calculations on the Palestinian side within within Gaza, and obviously we need to talk about Hamas here. And more generally, in terms of the structural argument, which you're presenting with this immobility nexus, I mean, what we're confronting here, observing here, is that quite uniquely, in terms of the post-war population exchanges and expulsions that we saw in East Central Europe, when the borders of Poland and Germany were redrawn, and Ukraine. Also in India and Pakistan, when they were formed in 1947, you had massive population displacements and expulsions and deaths and mass rapes, as in all these cases. What you have in Gaza case is that the population remains on the doorstep of the displacing power. I mean, it's literally there isn't even a border, as you say, in any hard sense until 1991. And that's not the case with the others. And what you have, therefore, is a small enclave compared to these other cases during which the post-war order is founded, like Eurasia, South Asia, and the Middle East are kind of reformed with new nation states after the convulsions of the Second World War. And there's a tacit understanding, which is confirmed by, say, the absence of ethnic cleansing in the Genocide Convention, that there's no unscrambling this omelet. Like, this is the way the post-war order is going to be, and these refugees stay in situ. Like, the Germans stay in Germany, the Poles stay in Poland, and so forth. And Muslims go to Pakistan, as many as possible, because of course hundreds of millions remain in India, and certainly all non-Muslims are expelled or induced to leave from Pakistan. Now, it's not cleanly done, completely done. In the case of the Nakba, because there's a remaining population of 20% within the state of Israel. It's under military occupation until 1966, as we know. Now, when Israel gets control of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, Gaza becomes, as I see it, an irredentist potential in the way that the West Bank does not. For example, in the Israeli security calculus, Gaza is a constant threat because you have, as you say, a refugee population whose leaders want to go back. Okay, and they will refer to a UN General Assembly resolution on a right of return. Like, it's a right, and people talk about this as a hard right. It's not just a vague aspiration. The West Bank, as you say, is a much smaller refugee population, about 30%. And there the Israelis are the irredentist power, because they're trying to change the status quo through settlement expansion and ultimately, increasing contraction of Palestinians into a smaller territory, and then hopefully, when they can, expulsion into Jordan. They've not managed that yet. They were really hoping that this would be the moment, particularly with Gaza, but it hasn't happened. We know in the last couple of days, because this so-called peace deal, that the ethnic cleansing Riviera project is not coming to pass. And yet, for the Israeli security establishment, Gaza will always be an irredentist, dangerously irredentist potential in the way the West Bank's not. I was wondering if you just elaborate on, these ideas, if they make any sense to you as an expert. But these are the things that occurred to me reading your work.
Yeah, thank you. It was really interesting listening to your reflections just then. I mean, a few things came to my mind. I think one probably obvious point is that the other distinction between the Nakba and the other cases you mentioned is that in all of those other cases, we're talking about the creation of nation states on all sides. So we can talk a little bit more clearly of an exchange. Whereas here we see the creation and establishment of one new state and the dispossession of the Palestinian people, so the loss of their homeland and not the establishment of a state. And that is quite a crucial difference, which is obviously not to dismiss any of the mass violence or suffering of South Asian partition or the exchanges you mentioned in post-war Europe. But that is quite a significant factor. We need to keep in mind that the Palestinians had been struggling for independent statehood for decades prior to 1948. So it was this real kind of frustration, to put it very mildly, that they end up being dispossessed and stateless in 1948. It's undoubtedly a key feature, I think, of various political dynamics that Gaza has this majority Nakba refugee population. It obviously gives rise to this bigger commitment to the idea of return, although, West Bank Palestinians are also committed to the right of return. It also, to some degree, it almost gives Gaza this feel that it's almost a microcosm of Palestine, because you have people there who've come from all different parts of Palestine. And there's also a kind of socioeconomic factor that Gaza, because of how much it's cut off from its economic hinterlands, compared to the West Bank from the beginning, it is much more impoverished, and therefore people have, all kinds of bigger incentives for political activism. There's various, archival records after 1967 of Israeli ministers and political classes talking really openly about the fact that they see Gaza as this bigger issue compared to the West Bank. The other factor there is that the West Bank is much more religiously significant. So it's not just that Gaza has this refugee population that creates these dynamics. It's also that the West Bank is seen as more desirable to Israel, and the West Bank has more strategic depth. All of that being said, it's worth noting that we've also seen some degree of Israeli irredentism in Gaza. There were, obviously, as there were Israeli settlements in Gaza from 1970 to 2005. There have been not just calls, but actual full-on developed plans in Israel to resettle Gaza over the last 2 years. And although it's obviously much less of a mass movement than the West Bank, the Gaza settler movement does also speak in irredentist terms. They talk about the fact that they are supposedly returning to Jewish areas that were evacuated during 1929 as a result of intercommunal violence and widespread attacks on Jews in Palestine that year. They will often frame it in terms of return. So there are those irredentist elements there as well. I think what's the other thing to keep in mind, though, which I talk about more in the book, is that if we go to, say, the period of the late 80s and the early 90s, which is obviously when we saw Oslo, and we saw this kind of, at least at the level of the political classes, shift towards the two-state paradigm, there was overwhelming support for that in Gaza. Actually, much more support among Palestinians in Gaza than there was among Israelis for Oslo and for the idea of a two-state solution. So it's not the case that the Palestinians in Gaza have never shown any flexibility or pragmatism or any willingness to compromise on this. Support for that went down significantly because Oslo turned into such a farce and things got so much worse for Palestinians. But I think there has also been some degree of myth-making among the Israeli political classes of this sort of inflexible Palestinian/Gazan attitude towards things, which doesn't really bear out if we look at the history.
Thanks for that. That really helps flesh things out. I mean, we could talk forever, given how much you write and how rich this case is for detailed ethnographic reconstruction, but also these broader contextual frames that we want to bring in. But we have time for one more question.
Yes. So we're planning to end all the interviews with book recommendations by the authors, and it would be nice to have some of your book recommendations. And
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this great question. I have 2 book recommendations that come to mind, if that's okay. And they're both testimonials by Palestinians. One is from Fawaz Turki, who is himself a Nakba refugee, who spent most of his childhood in Burj al-Barajneh refugee camp in Lebanon, having survived the Nakba with his family, then relocated to Australia for a while, ended up having a long career in the US. But in the 1990s, under Oslo, he was able to, quote unquote, return. And he went back to the places of his childhood in what was now Israel. And he published the third of his memoirs, which is called Exile's Return, which I would really highly recommend for, he lays out not only his own life experiences, but also his political and his philosophical reflections on the Palestinian experience. And he does so in a way that really speaks to the nuances of the human experience as a refugee, and that speaks to the ultimate, eternal challenges. The other book I would really recommend is Asma Al-Ghul, who has a book called A Rebel in Gaza. This is a lot more recent. It was published originally in French, and then the English translation came out a few years ago. And she is a journalist from Gaza, now based in Paris, I believe. Very outspoken activist, very outspoken against the Israeli occupation, the Israeli genocide. She also is an outspoken feminist who had various run-ins with the Hamas regime. And her book really gives a really informative insight into life in Gaza and into the different dynamics that shape political life there.
Well, thank you so much for those two recommendations, Anne. That's wonderful to hear. And thank you also for sharing your expertise and your deep historical knowledge of Gaza, as well as some of your views as to the future for Gaza. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Yes, thanks very much, Anne. And we look forward to seeing the reception of your new book, A Short History of Gaza.
Thank you.